She was 35 or 30 when she came into the royal family.
All of these lies started coming out, but we didn't know that she had told the royal.
Shame rarely comes from enemies. It comes from people who knew you before the image was polished, before the story was simplified, before the fairy tale demanded belief. For years, Prince Harry spoke as if the world had misunderstood Meghan Markle, as if rejection only began once royalty entered the picture. But according to a man from her life before palaces and protocols, the first rejection came much earlier, and it came quietly from a family who saw something they did not trust. This is not a story about a breakup. It is a story about warnings that never reached the prince who needed them most, and about what happens when the past speaks not in accusation but in explanation. Because once a pattern is named, it cannot be unseen. And even princes are not immune to that realization. Every royal story likes to begin at the gates. Engagement interviews, carriages, smiles that signal arrival. But the most consequential chapters rarely start there. They begin earlier, in ordinary homes around ordinary tables. Long before public relations learned the names involved. Before princes and palaces, Meghan Markle lived inside a much smaller world. One where ambition was visible without polish and patterns appeared before they were framed as destiny. According to accounts now resurfacing, that world included a man named Giuliano, and more. Importantly, his family. Families notice things institutions later formalize. They see how someone handles disagreement, how they treat loyalty, how quickly relationships become transactional. They observe not once, but repeatedly. And when families pull back, it is rarely dramatic. It is quiet. Invitations slow. Futures are discussed cautiously. Commitment is delayed, then withheld. That is where this story truly begins. According to Giuliano's account, the rejection did not come from jealousy, class anxiety, or prejudice. It came from concern. His family, he claims, sensed instability, a pattern of emotional intensity followed by strategic distance. An emphasis on advancement that eclipsed intimacy. These were not accusations. They were hesitations. And hesitation in family dynamics is often the final warning before separation. At the time, Meghan reframed that distance as misunderstanding, ambition misunderstood, drive mistaken for coldness. In her telling, resistance was proof that she was meant for more. That narrative would later become familiar. But in this earlier chapter, there was no palace to blame, no tabloids, no centuries-old institution to stand in as antagonist. There was only a family that chose not to proceed. This is where the stakes quietly rise. Because when Prince Harry entered Meghan's life years later, he encountered a carefully curated history. Struggle without warning. Reinvention without residue. Past relationships framed as chapters closed for reasons that required sympathy, not scrutiny. Harry, by nature and by trauma, was inclined to believe. He had spent years positioning himself as protector, as the man who would finally see what others had missed. The savior instinct was not a performance. It was sincere. And sincerity can be dangerous when it meets selective storytelling. Inside royal circles, vetting does not stop at resumes. It traces relationships, family reactions, long-term patterns. Advisors are trained to look for repetition, not incidents. And while no one initially flagged Giuliano's family as a red alert, their absence from Meghan's narrative did not go unnoticed. It was a silence that mattered. At Kensington Palace, early briefings noted gaps, not crimes, not scandals. Gaps, a former partner whose family disengaged without public conflict. A marriage that followed later with Trevor Ingleson, ending abruptly and without the emotional closure usually described in interviews. Individually, these details meant little. Together, they suggested a pattern of proximity followed by severance, advancement followed by detachment, reinvention that required others to disappear. Harry did not see this as a warning. He saw it as injustice. According to people familiar with his thinking at the time, he interpreted family rejection as proof of narrow-mindedness. He folded it into a larger narrative of Meghan being underestimated and mistreated. In doing so, he inverted the signal. What had been concern became cruelty. What had been caution became prejudice. This was the first fracture between perception and pattern. The palace, for its part, did not intervene. Early relationships are rarely decisive. Institutions wait for repetition before drawing conclusions, but they do remember. Files remain open. Notes accumulate. As the engagement approached, some advisors quietly revisited those early silences. Not to block the union, but to understand it. They asked why Meghan's past seemed populated by exits rather than continuities. Why families faded rather than integrated. These questions were not confrontational. They were preparatory. Harry, however, experienced them as betrayal. This is where the human drama sharpens. To him, any hesitation felt like rejection of the woman he loved. He doubled down. Emotionally, he dismissed caution as bias. In doing so, he positioned himself against the very mechanism designed to protect him. The prince, who had always struggled with abandonment, now mistook warning for abandonment. And so the story moved forward, propelled by love, defiance, and a belief that the past was irrelevant once a title was granted. But families do not forget what institutions eventually record. Giuliano's family did not reject Meghan because she would one day be royal. They rejected her before any of that was imaginable. Their concern, as now described, was not about where she came from, but how she moved through relationships, how people were used then outgrown, how loyalty was demanded but not always returned. When that explanation surfaced years later, it landed with a different weight because it reframed everything that followed. By the time Meghan Markle entered Prince Harry's world, her past had already been streamlined, not erased, but edited. Relationships were described as stepping stones. Breaks were framed as necessary growth. Families that drifted away were absent from the narrative altogether. What remained was a clean arc of ambition and resilience, designed to invite admiration rather than examination. Harry did not question it. In fact, he leaned into it. According to those who observed him closely during the early months of the relationship, Harry approached Meghan with a fierce protectiveness that bordered on urgency. He believed he was witnessing history repeat itself. A woman mistreated by systems. A woman misunderstood by those threatened by her independence. It fit too neatly with his own unresolved grief and anger toward institutions that had failed his mother. The story made emotional sense, and emotional sense for Harry often outweighed procedural caution. This is where the warning failed to land. Giuliano's family, as now described, did not reject Meghan loudly or cruelly. They did what families do when they sense long-term instability. They slowed things down. They resisted permanence. They questioned alignment. These are not dramatic acts. They are protective ones. But protection can look like rejection when ambition is already pointed elsewhere. When Harry later encountered references to that period, he reportedly dismissed them. In his mind, early family resistance confirmed what he already believed, that Meghan had always been too big, too driven, too disruptive for conventional spaces. He interpreted hesitation as fear, distance as envy. In doing so, he recoded caution into oppression. This reframing became a pattern. When Meghan spoke about her first marriage to Trevor Engelson, the emphasis was on incompatibility and growth. The ending was described as sad but necessary. What was rarely explored was the abruptness of the severance, the speed with which that chapter closed, the absence of lingering connection, shared history, or reconciliation. Again, none of this proved wrongdoing, but it suggested something Harry did not want to see. That proximity in Meghan's life often came with an expiration date. Palace advisors noticed. At Kensington Palace, vetting teams are trained to look for continuity, long friendships, family integration, evidence that someone's past does not require constant reinvention. In Meghan's case, what they found was not scandal, but fragmentation, different lives, different circles, minimal overlap. People who once mattered no longer mentioned. When these observations were raised gently, Harry bristled. According to accounts from those present, he heard judgment where none was stated. He accused advisors of searching for flaws, of refusing to see Meghan as she was now. He argued that the past was irrelevant, that love transformed everything. This was the second warning missed because institutions do not study the past to punish. They study it to predict. Repetition is their primary concern. And repetition does not announce itself dramatically. It hides in patterns of departure, not arrival. The more Harry defended Meghan, the more isolated he became from voices urging caution. This isolation was not imposed. It was chosen. He trusted his instincts over experience, emotion over precedent. In doing so, he unknowingly stepped into a familiar royal tragedy. The belief that love alone can neutralize pattern. Behind the scenes, palace factions began to harden. One group argued that Harry's emotional state made objective assessment impossible, that pressing too hard would only deepen his resistance. They recommended accommodation, let the marriage proceed, trust that responsibility would stabilize behavior. Another group was less optimistic. They pointed to Giuliano's family as an early signal to Angleson's abrupt disappearance as reinforcement. They warned that when people repeatedly exit others' lives without explanation, it often signals not bad luck, but strategy. Advancement through alignment followed by detachment once the next door opens. Harry rejected this framing entirely. To him, it sounded like character assassination disguised as concern. He accused the palace of doing what families before them had done, failing to believe in Meghan. In response, he doubled down publicly. Engagement interviews emphasized destiny. Speeches framed love as defiance. The fairy tale became not just romantic, but ideological. This is where the stakes escalated beyond personal choice. Once Harry framed opposition as moral failure, he closed the door on nuance. Anyone who questioned Meghan's past was no longer cautious. They were cruel. Anyone who hesitated was no longer thoughtful. They were prejudiced. This binary framing left no space for warning to be heard. Meghan understood this dynamic well. According to people familiar with her approach, she reinforced Harry's instincts subtly but consistently. Past rejections were recast as evidence of her strength. Families who pulled away were portrayed as unable to keep up. Each severed relationship became proof that she was meant for something bigger. This narrative rewarded loyalty and punished doubt. Harry responded exactly as expected. He chose loyalty. By the time doubts resurfaced later, they carried a different weight. Not as isolated concerns, but as echoes. The Giuliano family's early hesitation now looked less like anomaly and more like pattern. The Angleson marriage less like bad timing and more like precedent. The palace's resistance less like prejudice and more like déjà vu. This was the moment Harry could no longer ignore. According to those close to him, shame replaced anger. Not shame toward Meghan, but toward himself. The realization that warnings had existed, that they had come not from tabloids or institutions, but from ordinary families with nothing to gain, and that he had dismissed them all as enemies. This shame was private and corrosive. It did not erupt in confrontation. It settled into silence. Harry began withdrawing from advisors he once trusted. He avoided conversations that revisited the past. The cost of acknowledging the pattern was too high. It would mean admitting that love had not blinded the world. It had blinded him. For the palace, this realization arrived too late to matter. Institutions cannot rewind marriages. They can only manage consequences. By the time the pattern was fully visible, it was already entrenched at the highest level of public life. And so the warning Joe Giuliano's family once embodied resurfaced not as accusation but as explanation. They had not rejected Meghan because she lacked worth. They had rejected permanence because they sensed impermanence, a life oriented toward the next chapter rather than the current bond. Harry had mistaken that signal for cruelty, and in doing so, he walked willingly into a story whose ending now felt painfully familiar. This was no longer about who was right or wrong. It was about how many times a warning can appear before it becomes history. By the time the palace reached its own conclusions, the marriage was no longer a question. It was a fact. And institutions do not undo facts. They adjust around them. Inside Buckingham Palace, the tone shifted from curiosity to calculation. Early concerns that had once been framed as caution were quietly reclassified as indicators, not accusations. Indicators, the kind that only make sense in retrospect when separate events begin to align into something coherent. This is how institutions think. They do not rely on single incidents. They wait for repetition. What had once seemed like isolated resistance from a former boyfriend's family now sat alongside a pattern of severed ties. Families that did not integrate, friendships that faded without explanation, a first. Marriage that ended cleanly, almost surgically, with no lingering bridge back. Each detail alone meant little. Together, they suggested momentum over permanence. For the palace, the realization was sobering. This was not a story of a woman rejected because she was different. It was a story of a woman whose relationships followed a consistent arc: intensity, alignment, advancement, exit, reinvention. The institution had seen versions of this before, not just in royal spouses, but in figures who orbit power without anchoring to it. The tragedy was timing. Had these patterns been recognized earlier, they might have shaped expectations rather than outcomes. Instead, they arrived after vows, after global attention, after lines had been publicly drawn. At that point, the palace could not confront. It could only contain. For Prince Harry, this containment felt like abandonment. He interpreted distance as punishment. He believed the institution was withdrawing support out of spite. What he did not see was that withdrawal was standard protocol. When certainty disappears, institutions pull back, not to wound, but to survive. Harry's shame deepened in this phase, not because the palace doubted Meghan, but because the doubts echoed warnings he had once dismissed himself. When advisors referenced continuity, he heard criticism. When they spoke of pattern, he heard prejudice. Only later did he understand that they were describing something families had already sensed long before royalty entered the picture. That realization was isolating. According to people close to him, Harry stopped arguing. The anger that had once fueled his public speeches cooled into something heavier: acceptance without peace. He began to understand that the story he had defended as persecution now looked from the outside like predictability. For Meghan Markle, the palace's recalibration confirmed what she had always believed: that institutions resist change, that skepticism is simply fear-wearing formality. She did not interpret distance as warning. She interpreted it as validation, proof that she had outgrown another environment. This divergence in interpretation widened the gap between husband and institution. Harry wanted acknowledgement. Meghan wanted autonomy. The palace wanted stability. These goals could not coexist. And so the system did what it always does when alignment fails. It reduced exposure. Titles remained. Formalities persisted, but warmth receded. This is where history begins to harden. In royal life, stories are not judged only by intent, but by outcome. The outcome here was unmistakable. A prince estranged from his family, an institution managing risk through distance, a narrative of rejection that no longer held when examined against earlier non-royal rejections. Giuliano's family, once a footnote, now looked like a preface. They had no titles to protect, no institution to appease, no audience to persuade. Their rejection carried none of the incentives critics accused the palace of having. It existed quietly, long before fame complicated interpretation. That is why it mattered. For Harry, the humiliation was not public. It was internal. To accept that those early warnings were not cruelty, but concern would mean accepting that love had not been enough to override pattern. That his instincts, so often shaped by loss and defensiveness, had led him away from clarity rather than toward it. This is not a realization that produces confrontation. It produces silence. As time passed, the palace's approach proved consistent. No dramatic rupture, no reconciliation theater, just a steady acknowledgement that the story had reached its natural boundary. The crown would endure. The marriage would continue on its own terms. The two would no longer pretend to share a single narrative. That is how royal stories end. When they cannot be resolved. Not with apologies, not with vindication, but with separation of record. Harry's shame did not come from being proven wrong by enemies. It came from recognizing that people who cared long before palaces and protocols had seen something he refused to see, and that once a pattern is clear, defending against it only deepens the cost. The palace did not reject Meghan because she failed to belong. It adjusted because belonging had never been the goal. Continuity was, and continuity, once broken too many times, cannot be repaired by love alone. Royal scandals often focus on endings, but the truth usually lives at the beginning. If you want more royal documentaries that examine patterns, ignored warnings, and the cost of believing the wrong story, subscribe and stay with us. History does not shout.